So I was doing some digging on verbal aspect for my online Greek course that I'm teaching this semester. I ran into a few articles, and one of them was this article by David Mathewson from Denver. It's from Bulletin for Biblical Research, about 6 years ago now, I guess. And I found it very interesting. There's not a lot in here necessarily that I hadn't heard before. It just clicked in a way that I wish I had read this back in 2013, because he explains some stuff in a way that I wish had been explained to me originally. I was just kind of wondering what you guys might think about it. He starts by kind of not reviewing, but looking back at Stagg's article. Dan Wallace cites this article in his, I think it's his Greek grammar, but basically he definitely talks about how when we start getting into verbal aspects, there was this growing understanding that people were misusing the aorist tense, calling it point in time or instantaneous or once for all action. So this article by Frank Stagg, that was sort of the seminal article on this, that he points out a bunch of Stagg points out a bunch of examples where commentators are attributing to the aorist tense something that they shouldn't, namely, punctiliar or one time, once for all action. So Mathewson writes this article that was called The Abused Aorist. This one's called The Abused Present, and he's doing something similar with the present tense. He's talking now about what we tend to say the present tense means as far as what imperfective aspect tells us about a verb. What he really kind of rails against is this idea that we have been taught that the present tense describes continuous, durative, ongoing, or habitual action. And obviously this is something that Mounce covers. Mounce teaches this, that the present tense has sort of this idea of action that is continuous or iterative or something like that. The thing that confused me about this at first was he was using continuous. He's using these words in a way that's a little bit differently than what I heard when I was. What he clarifies. So first of all, if the present tense does not connote continuous, durative, ongoing, or habitual action, what does it connote? All right, Mathewson, if you're disagreeing with this description of the present, then what is your description of what the aspect of the present tense is? And what he calls the present tense aspect is unfolding action. Here he says, and he's quoting, he quotes Porter on aspect, and actually in part of this, when he's going through grammars, he gives a little bit more grace to Porter and some of the confusing things he said than he does to others. But he starts with Porter's definition of aspect, what it is, and then he goes with Porter's definition of the present tense, what the present tense connotes. And Porter says the action is conceived of by the language user, so this is the author or writer. The action is conceived of by the speaker as being in progress. I could not understand how that was different from continuous. And I think in Wallace's grammar, he distinguishes between continuous and continual. And that's kind of I could make a distinction, but I'm not sure I think I'm just making it up. But this idea of it being in progress, I'm like, well, how is that different? This is continual. Well, what Mathewson is trying to point out is the present tense, and he goes through here and gives a lot of examples of the present tense in New Testament Greek that is used for one-time action, that is used for actions that are not what he calls non-durative. And so that's going to be, he gives an example of, I think the centurion, Jairus, Mark 5:22. Jairus sees Jesus and falls at his feet. Well, it can't be more instantaneous than falling. It's not like he continued to fall. Okay, Mathewson, so then why is it in the present? Why isn't it in the aorist? And what Mathewson would say is what the present tense offers as far as aspect goes is not necessarily continuous action or ongoing action. It offers an internal perspective of that action where the action is seen as unfolding before your eyes, kind of. Now, this is language very similar to what Constantine Campbell uses in his Basics of Verbal Aspect in Biblical Greek. That's close to the title of the book, that little Zondervan volume. Mathewson here is distinguishing between distinguishing between durative, habitual, continuous. He's calling those words description of actionsart, not of aspect. If you want to describe aspect, you need to use a concept like unfolding or internal, whereas continuous, progressive, durative, these are describing actionsart, not aspect. And that was something that, until he kind of separated those categories for me, I had jumbled those up. I didn't really understand the difference in the type of category that durative was versus unfolding, because I was kind of conflating those two types of descriptions. So anyways, I thought this was a very helpful article. Like I said, there's not a lot here that I haven't heard before. It's just he presents it in a way that just all of a sudden made sense, and I wish that I had originally heard it explained this way. I wanted to go over just an excerpt or two here to point out a couple things that I thought were really interesting. I think it starts here. He says, therefore, the present tense should be understood from the perspective of verbal aspect. According to Porter, and I think there's a place where it actually says Forder. His P's and F's get a little, I guess I should blame that on BBR. But according to Porter, with the author's choice of the present tense form, the action is conceived of by the language user as being in progress. In other words, its internal structure is seen as unfolding. The implication of this definition is significant. Aspectually, the present tense form's viewpoint is internal. This is his whole point. It's looking at the action from the perspective of its development, rather than this gets a little bit close to the idea of heightened proximity that Campbell talks about. I'm sure Porter talks about that as well. But this is looking at the action of the verb from an internal perspective, a very closely involved perspective, as opposed to a distant perspective. It looks at the action from the perspective of its development and unfolding, irrespective of the actual duration or time of the action being portrayed. The present tense form provides more of a close-up perspective on the action, as if the author looks at the action from inside. Again, some of these descriptions, if you're not familiar with this type of terminology, it all sounds real similar. It's hard to get the nuance of the distinctions that he's making, but he's getting back to the idea that aspect has to do with perspective, not the sort of action that's taking place, be it instantaneous or progressive or whatever. Aspect has to do with the perspective of the speaker. He's heavily emphasizing that. The present tense describes the action, while the aorist summarizes the action. So this present tense, one way to say is it might be a more vivid portrayal of the action, whereas the aorist is more summary. It's more what he seems to be saying here. I had always looked at the aorist as sort of the bland default, and maybe he's still saying that. But he seems to be drawing a little bit more of an opposition or a dichotomy, not dichotomy. I had learned to view the aorist not as the opposite of the present, but as sort of the neutral of the present. And I feel like he's making it a little bit more like the opposite again. I'm not sure. Maybe that doesn't make any sense. I'm kind of talking out loud with that. But he seems to have a different take on the relationship between the present tense and the aorist tense as far as verbal aspect goes than what I had thought was the case. What this means is that the above labels, typically assigned to the present tense, continuous, durative, and so on, are not the semantic property of the present tense form itself. Rather, they represent information or possible realizations of the tense form that pragmatically comes from broader contextual features. Again, if you're not used to the jargon, that's a very complicated and confusing sentence. But what he's saying is, he and Porter as well drives really hard at this idea of, if we want to understand what the present tense means, we have to understand the semantics of it and not the pragmatics of it. The semantics of it basically says this is what the present tense always contributes to a word. The pragmatics would be this is what the present tense does, or this is what happens with the present tense. It's the present tense in context. Wallace makes a good point that you never have a present tense by itself. You never have a truly semantic example of the present tense, because the present tense has to have some sort of, it has to have voice, it has to have person, it has to have context. Like, there is no semantic meaning just for present tense. I get what he's saying there. I think he might be talking past Porter a little bit, but this distinction between the semantics of the meaning, or the semantics of the present tense versus the pragmatics, has to do with the idea of what can we say is always true of the present, so that we don't have 10 different categories of present that are kind of mutually exclusive, or that are contradictory to one another. What is always true of the present? And what Mathewson is saying is that the present doesn't always describe durative action or progressive action. There are times when it describes instantaneous action. So we can't say that the present tense semantically is progressive. What can we say is always true of the present tense? Well, what we can say is that it always describes an action from an internal perspective where the action is developing or unfolding. Now, that needs to be tested. Like, someone would need to go through every use of the present tense and ask, does Mathewson's definition of the present tense as far as aspect goes, does that hold true for every use here? Because he's gone through and picked out examples where, you know, the progressive idea doesn't always apply. Someone would probably need to do that with this definition as well, and I'm sure someone has. But that's his big thesis here, is the idea that when we ask what can we say is always true of the present tense, here's what we can say. It always describes action from an internal perspective where the action of the verb is described as developing or unfolding. So other descriptions of that would be, it's a more vivid description or something like that. Emphasis would be another reason why someone would choose to use the present tense rather than the aorist tense. But he certainly doesn't believe that it, even in the indicative, that time is semantic to it, that it always includes present time. And he also doesn't agree that it's always sort of that progressive actionsart. So what's really helpful here is he is pointing out a category confusion that's taking place in grammars. People are using terms that are descriptions of actionsart for verbal aspect, and that's something that does need to be clarified. So anyways, I think there was maybe one or two other things that he gives a bunch of examples of non-progressive uses of the present throughout the Bible, and then he goes on sort of a, it's probably hard to follow with it this big. Let me minimize this a little bit. He then gives, let's see, he traces Greek grammars over the last couple centuries, pointing out sort of the inconsistent things that have been said. He goes through commentaries that have spoken on this, and that might be it. Yeah, so here he's just reiterating his thesis. So anyways, I just wanted to kind of throw this out there to the group and see if you guys have any thoughts on it. You can find this Again, Mathewson is the author, Abuse Present. It's in Bulletin for Biblical Research 23.3, 2013, pages 343 through 363. So you can find this on Joshua pretty easily. But I'd like to know what you think. Again, nothing real new here, but it was interesting.